It was a quiet, cloudless night in the small town of Vale Verde. The full moon loomed in the sky, its silvery glow casting long, eerie shadows across the deserted streets. The air was unusually still, as if the town itself held its breath. Whispers of an ancient curse had long haunted this place, a tale of a monstrous werewolf that emerged under the light of the full moon to claim its prey. For decades, these stories had been dismissed by most as folklore, something to keep children from wandering into the woods at night. But deep down, the townsfolk knew the stories carried an ominous truth, a truth that no one dared confront. That night, the air carried an unsettling energy. The usual sounds of crickets and distant owls were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against the ears like static. In the heart of this silence, Rogério, known for his arrogant bravado, scoffed at the old tales. A werewolf? Seriously? Only cowards believe in such nonsense, he sneered, his voice echoing louder than it should in the stillness. Yet, even he couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Meanwhile, Clara, a police officer driven by a past she couldn't escape, was patrolling the empty streets. Her thoughts drifted to Lucas, her brother who had vanished 5 years ago under circumstances too bizarre to explain. That night had been like this, still eerie, and shrouded in a suffocating dread. She couldn't forget the look in her brother's eyes before he disappeared, a mix of terror and resignation, as if he knew something she didn't. Her patrol car's radio crackled suddenly, jolting her from her thoughts. The voice on the other end was panicked, trembling. "Officer Clara, we've received reports. Something's out there in the woods. People are missing. Screams have been heard." A chill ran down Clara's spine as she gripped the radio. The voice continued, each word drenched in fear. "They say it's not human." In the distance, the first howl shattered the night. Low and guttural, it carried an unnatural resonance, echoing through the streets and seeping into every corner of the town. Rogério froze mid-laugh, the blood draining from his face. Clara, clutching the steering wheel, felt her heart quicken. The stories she'd dismissed as a child came rushing back with visceral clarity. She knew this was no ordinary call. It was the beginning of something far darker, something that would force her to confront the shadows of her past and the terror that lurked just beyond the edge of reason. What you're about to hear is not just a story. It's a chilling, real account of fear, loss, and the supernatural. If you crave tales that challenge your perception of reality, subscribe to Sinister Stories now and hit the bell icon. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Some truths are darker than any fiction. The town of Vale Verde sat nestled in a valley surrounded by dense, ancient forests. By day, the sunlight danced through the towering trees, casting a serene glow over the town. But at night, those same trees seemed to twist and contort, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. The forest had always been a place of whispered fears, with locals warning children never to wander too far into its depths. They spoke of a darkness that lingered there, unseen, but always felt. It was into this foreboding forest that Clara and her hastily assembled team ventured. The path leading into the woods was narrow, lined with gnarled roots that jutted out like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder with each step, a biting chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Fog coiled around their feet, thick and unyielding, muffling their movements and making every step feel like an intrusion into a place that did not want them there. The moon, once bright and full, was now obscured by the canopy of trees, its light reduced to faint slivers that barely illuminated the way. Clara walked ahead, her flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The beam revealed glimpses of the forest, a broken branch here, a patch of disturbed soil there, but the deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to close in around them. It wasn't just the physical closeness of the trees, it was the sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking their every move. Rogério, trailing at the back, tried to mask his growing unease with humor. "This place looks like something out of a bad horror movie," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed through the trees, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The group froze. Clara's hand instinctively went to her gun, her heart pounding in her chest. The growl was followed by a rustling in the bushes ahead, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. The team exchanged nervous glances, their breaths visible in the frigid air. "Did you hear that?" whispered one of the officers, his voice barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. Clara nodded, her grip tightening on the flashlight. The rustling grew louder, moving closer, until it stopped just beyond the reach of the light. They stood in tense silence, every muscle in their bodies coiled, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. Then, without warning, a deafening howl pierced the air. It was a sound unlike anything they had ever heard, animalistic yet disturbingly human, filled with a rage and sorrow that sent shivers down their spines. Rogério stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, his voice trembling. Clara didn't answer. She was too focused on the darkness ahead, where the faint outline of something massive and hunched lurked just beyond the light. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if the trees themselves were afraid to move. The thing in the shadows shifted, its glowing eyes briefly catching the light. Clara felt her stomach drop. Those eyes were not just watching, they were studying, calculating, as if deciding whether to strike. And then it moved. The shadows seemed to ripple as the figure darted out of sight with an unnatural speed, leaving only the faint echo of its growl. Clara's flashlight swept the area, but there was nothing, just the silent, oppressive forest, and the weight of the terror that had begun to seep into their hearts. Whatever was out there was no ordinary predator. It was something older, darker, and far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. As the group pushed further into the depths of the forest, the air seemed to grow heavier with every step. It wasn't just the chill that gnawed at their bones, it was an oppressive weight, an invisible force that made it hard to breathe. The forest was unnaturally silent now, the usual nocturnal symphony of insects and rustling leaves conspicuously absent. Each creak of a branch, each muffled step, echoed unnaturally loud in the void, as if the forest itself were amplifying their presence. Then came the first sound, soft and distant, almost imperceptible at first. A faint whisper, like the wind weaving through the trees, but it carried an unnatural cadence. It wasn't the random rustle of leaves. It was deliberate, a disembodied murmur in a language none of them could recognize. Clara froze, her flashlight sweeping through the dense trees. "Did anyone else hear that?" She whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hear what?" Rogério snapped, though his bravado was beginning to waver. But before anyone could answer, a new sound emerged, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo from every direction. It was the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush, each step deliberate, purposeful. The group clustered closer, their flashlights darting erratically, each beam carving out a fleeting slice of visibility in the surrounding darkness. Clara's heart pounded as she strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The thumping grew louder, closer, yet nothing appeared in the beams of light. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the forest, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, a nauseating blend of damp earth and something far worse. The officers exchanged nervous glances, their breaths fogging the air as the chill intensified. Then came the first scream, a sharp, piercing cry from somewhere deep in the forest. It was human, unmistakably so, but it was filled with a terror so raw that it sent a wave of cold panic through the group. Clara instinctively drew her weapon, her mind racing. "Stay together," she commanded, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her throat. The scream was followed by a distant crash, the sound of something large breaking through branches. The group turned their flashlights toward the direction of the noise, but all they saw were the endless shadows of the trees. The thumping resumed, now accompanied by a series of guttural growls, low and menacing, as if whatever was out there was taunting them, circling them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, without warning, the flashlight of one of the officers flickered and died, plunging them into even deeper darkness. He frantically shook the device, his breathing rapid and uneven. "It's dead." My flashlight just, before he could finish, the beam of another flashlight flickered and faded, followed by another. One by one, the lights began to fail, as if the darkness itself was swallowing them whole. Panic set in as the group huddled together, their remaining lights casting desperate beams into the encroaching blackness. Clara could feel the fear emanating from everyone around her, but she forced herself to stay focused. She aimed her flashlight at the nearest tree, its beam catching a series of deep claw marks gouged into the bark. The sight sent a chill down her spine. "Those weren't there before," she muttered, her voice barely audible. Rogério, now visibly shaken, took a step back, his bravado completely stripped away. This isn't right," he stammered. "We need to get out of here." But just as the words left his mouth, another sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that came from directly behind them. It was impossibly close, and this time, there was no mistaking its intent. Whatever was out, there was no longer content to linger in the shadows. It was here, and it wanted them to know it. The growl lingered in the air, reverberating through the forest like an ominous drumbeat. The group spun around, their remaining flashlights casting trembling beams into the impenetrable darkness. There was nothing visible, no movement, no eyes glinting in the shadows, yet the sound had been so close, so visceral. It was as if the darkness itself were alive, pulsating with a malevolent presence that seemed to close in around them. Clara's mind raced as she gripped her weapon tighter, her knuckles white from the pressure. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat, to lead her team back to the safety of the town, but something deeper, something primal and unrelenting, kept her rooted in place. It was the memory of Lucas, his face flashing in her mind, the last night she'd seen him, and the unspoken promise she had made to herself. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. "We're not turning back," Clara said firmly, her voice cutting through the growing panic among the group. "Whatever is out here, we need to find it. And we need to stop it." Her determination was met with nervous glances, the officers reluctant but unwilling to disobey her. Rogério, however, was not so easily convinced. "Are you out of your mind?" he snapped, his voice shaking. "You heard that thing. It's not human. We'll end up just like the others. We need to get out of here now." Clara turned to face him, her expression hard as steel. "You can run if you want to," she said coldly. "But if you do, you're on your own." Her words hung in the air, a challenge that Rogério wasn't prepared to meet. He opened his mouth to argue, but the look in her eyes silenced him. As if on cue, the forest seemed to respond to her defiance. A sudden, sharp cracking sound echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable rustle of something large moving just out of sight. The group froze, their breaths held as they strained to hear. The rustling stopped, replaced by a chilling silence that felt heavier than the growl had been. "It's circling us," one of the officers whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, her mind calculating their options. They couldn't see it, but it was clear the creature was watching, testing their resolve. Every instinct told her that running would only provoke it, but staying in one place was just as dangerous. "We move forward," Clara decided, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "Stay close, keep your lights on, and don't stop for anything." The group began to move, their steps slow and deliberate. The path ahead was barely visible, overgrown with roots and underbrush that seemed to pull at their feet. Each step felt like a gamble, the forest around them alive with the possibility of attack. The growl came again, this time from their left, followed by another from the right. Rogério stumbled, his foot catching on a root. He cursed under his breath, panic overtaking him as he scrambled to his feet. "This is insane," he hissed, his voice cracking. "We're walking straight into its trap." Clara ignored him, her focus unyielding. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back. She couldn't shake the feeling that this forest, this creature, was tied to Lucas's disappearance. If there was even a chance of finding answers, she had to see it through. But the deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet became soft and uneven, as if they were walking on something alive. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of unintelligible voices that seemed to mock their every step. "We need to stop," Rogério said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep going like this. We're gonna die out here." Clara turned to him, her flashlight catching the fear etched into his face. For a moment, she considered his words. She could feel the exhaustion setting in, the weight of the darkness pressing down on her. But then she remembered Lucas, his laugh, his teasing smile, and the pain of losing him. "If you want to leave, go," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm not stopping until I find out what's really out here." Rogério hesitated, torn between his fear and his pride. He glanced at the others, searching for support, but found only silent resolve. With a frustrated growl of his own, he fell back into the group, muttering curses under his breath. Clara pressed on, the weight of her decision settling heavily on her shoulders. She knew the risk she was taking, but the alternative, turning back and leaving the mystery unsolved, was unthinkable. The forest around them seemed to sense her determination, the shadows growing darker, the air colder. The growls returned, louder and closer, as if the creature itself was acknowledging her challenge. She tightened her grip on her weapon, her flashlight cutting through the oppressive blackness. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the stillness so oppressive it felt alive, as if the very trees were witnesses to what was about to unfold. The growls intensified, resonating through the thick canopy, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. Clara's flashlight flickered, the beam trembling as though it, too, were afraid of the darkness ahead. Her team moved closer together, forming a fragile circle of light amidst the all-encompassing blackness. Then it happened. A shadow, larger than anything natural, darted between the trees with an unnerving speed. It was there for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to freeze the group in terror. Clara's heart pounded, her grip on her weapon tightening as her mind raced to process what she had just seen. It had been massive, hunched, and undeniably alive. The air around them seemed to shift, growing heavier, colder, as if the forest itself was reacting to the presence of the creature. A guttural snarl erupted from the darkness, this time so close it seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Before anyone could react, a tree branch snapped loudly, echoing like a gunshot. Rogério let out an involuntary yelp, stumbling backward as his flashlight slipped from his trembling hands. It hit the ground with a dull thud, its light extinguished, leaving the shadows to press in closer. "What the hell is that?" one of the officers whispered, his voice shaking, his eyes wide with terror. Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was locked on the shifting shadows, just beyond the reach of their remaining lights. The creature was there, watching, waiting. She could feel its gaze, cold and calculating, as if it were savoring their fear. Then, with a suddenness that sent shockwaves through the group, it appeared. The creature stepped into the faint light, its monstrous form finally revealed. It was a towering beast, its body a grotesque fusion of man and animal. Thick, matted fur covered its hulking frame, and its glowing eyes burned like embers in the darkness. Its snout curled back to reveal rows of jagged teeth, glistening with saliva, as it let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. For a moment, time seemed to stop. No one moved, no one breathed, as the enormity of the creature's presence consumed them. It was not just its size or its unnatural form. It was the sheer malevolence that radiated from it, a primal, ancient hatred that seemed to seep into their very souls. Rogério, unable to contain his terror, turned and bolted, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush. "Rogério, no!" Clara shouted, but it was too late. The creature's head snapped in his direction, its eyes narrowing as a predatory snarl escaped its throat. In an instant, it lunged, moving with a speed that defied its massive size. The group could only watch in horror as the creature disappeared into the darkness after Rogério. His screams shattered the stillness, each cry of terror more desperate than the last. Then, abruptly, there was silence. A suffocating, deafening silence that pressed down on the remaining officers like a physical weight. Clara's mind raced, every fiber of her being screaming at her to run, but she stood her ground. Rogério's fate was sealed. She knew that much, but there was no turning back. She raised her weapon, her flashlight trembling in her other hand, as she scanned the darkness for any sign of the creature. "Stay together," she commanded, her voice firm despite the fear constricting her chest. The group tightened their formation, their breaths shallow and rapid, as the oppressive silence stretched on. Then, a faint rustling reached their ears. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, closer, until it was all around them. "It's toying with us," one of the officers muttered, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, her jaw set. The creature wasn't just a mindless beast. It was intelligent, calculating, and it was hunting them. Suddenly, the rustling stopped. The forest was still again, but the air felt charged, electric with tension. Clara's flashlight flicked upward, catching the faintest movement above. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it. The creature, perched high in the trees, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. It moved like a shadow, swift and silent, leaping from branch to branch as if defying gravity itself. "Move!" Clara shouted, breaking the paralysis that had gripped the group. They ran, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they stumbled through the forest. The creature's snarls followed them, echoing through the trees, growing louder and more guttural with each passing moment. But no matter how fast they ran, the sense of being hunted never left. The creature wasn't chasing them, it was herding them, guiding them deeper into the forest, towards something far worse than they could imagine. Clara's mind raced, but one thought overpowered all others: there was no escape. Not yet. Not until she faced whatever had claimed her brother, and whatever was waiting for them in the heart of the darkness. The forest seemed to pulse with malevolence as Clara and her team ran, their flashlights barely piercing the suffocating darkness. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted their movement. The growls of the creature echoed all around them, a relentless reminder of its presence. It wasn't just hunting them, it was leading them, steering them deeper into its domain. Clara's chest tightened as the realization sank in. They were heading exactly where it wanted them to go. The trees began to change. What had once been towering, ancient trunks were now twisted and gnarled, their bark blackened and cracked as if scorched by some unholy fire. Strange symbols carved into the wood seemed to glow faintly, pulsating with an otherworldly light. The air grew thick and acrid, carrying the metallic tang of blood mixed with the stench of decay. Clara's skin prickled as the whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "We shouldn't be here," one of the officers whispered, his voice trembling. "This place that's wrong." Clara didn't respond. She couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on the clearing that lay ahead, bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. The trees parted, revealing a wide, circular space littered with bones, animal and human, their bleached remains glinting in the faint light. At the center of the clearing stood an enormous stone altar, its surface stained dark with what could only be old, dried blood. Above it, suspended by ropes and pulleys fashioned from twisted vines, hung a large iron cage. It swayed gently in the still air, its metal bars gleaming dully. And then she saw it, the creature. It stood on the altar, its massive frame illuminated by the pale light that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Up close, it was even more horrifying, a grotesque hybrid of man and beast, its matted fur slick with a dark, viscous substance. Its glowing eyes bore into Clara with a chilling intelligence, as though it recognized her, as though it knew why she was there. Clara raised her weapon, her hands trembling but steady enough to aim. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice echoing across the clearing. The creature tilted its head, its lips curling back to reveal jagged, blood-stained teeth. It didn't answer, but it didn't need to. The answer was in the symbols on the trees, the altar, the cage. It was in the memories she'd tried so hard to suppress. And then, from the shadows behind the altar, a figure emerged. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw him. Lucas. He was gaunt and pale, his clothes tattered and blood-stained, but it was him. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were now hollow, filled with a darkness that chilled her to her core. "Lucas?" Clara whispered, taking a tentative step forward, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the creature, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were in a trance. The creature let out a low growl, and Lucas dropped to his knees before it, his head bowed in submission. "No," Clara's voice broke as the reality of the situation hit her like a freight train. Her brother wasn't just a victim of this monstrosity, he was a part of it. The creature had claimed him, twisted him, turned him into something unrecognizable. Suddenly, Lucas raised his head, his eyes locking onto hers. "You shouldn't have come, Clara," he said, his voice low and fractured, like shards of broken glass. "It won't let you leave." The creature let out a deafening roar, its claws digging into the altar as it crouched, preparing to lunge. Clara's team shouted, their flashlights scattering erratically as they scrambled to defend themselves. But Clara couldn't move. She was frozen, torn between the primal urge to run and the unbearable need to save her brother. In a split second, the creature leapt, its massive form a blur of fur and claws. Clara fired her weapon, the gunshots echoing like thunder, but it barely slowed the beast. It slammed into the group, scattering them like leaves in a storm. Clara hit the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs as her flashlight rolled out of reach. In the chaos, she heard Lucas's voice again, louder this time. "It's the only way, Clara. End it." Her eyes darted to the altar, to the faintly glowing symbols, and then back to Lucas. She understood. Whatever this creature was, it was tied to this place, to the rituals and the darkness that had consumed her brother. And if she wanted to stop it, to save him, she had to destroy it, no matter the cost. Clara staggered to her feet, grabbing her flashlight and weapon. She sprinted toward the altar, dodging the creature's massive claws as it turned its attention back to her. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she climbed onto the altar, her hands fumbling to light a flare she'd taken from her belt. The creature roared, its glowing eyes locking onto her as it lunged again. But this time Clara was ready. She thrust the lit flare into the center of the altar, igniting the ancient, blood-stained symbols. A blinding light erupted, engulfing the clearing in an otherworldly glow. The creature let out a piercing scream, its body writhing and contorting as the light consumed it. When the light faded, the creature was gone, and so was Lucas. Clara fell to her knees, her vision blurred with tears. The clearing was silent now, the oppressive weight lifted, but the emptiness it left behind was suffocating. She had ended the nightmare, but the cost was unimaginable. Lucas was free, but she would carry the scars of that night forever. And in the silence, Clara swore she heard his voice one last time, carried on the wind. "Thank you." The forest stood eerily silent in the aftermath, as if the land itself mourned what had transpired. The oppressive darkness that had gripped the clearing seemed to dissipate, but it left behind an emptiness that gnawed at Clara's soul. Her knees pressed against the cold, blood-stained altar as she stared at the spot where Lucas had been, now nothing more than a memory. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of charred wood and iron, mingling with the faint whispers that seemed to linger just beyond her hearing. The other officers approached cautiously, their faces pale and drawn. They avoided looking at the remnants of the altar, their eyes instead flickering to Clara, whose hands trembled as she clutched the remnants of her flare. One officer broke the silence, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. What just happened?" Clara didn't answer immediately. How could she explain what she had seen, what she had done? Her mind reeled with the enormity of it all, the creature, the rituals, Lucas. Especially Lucas. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to stand. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her chest, threatening to suffocate her. "We end it here," she finally said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "No one can know about this place. No one." The officers exchanged uneasy glances but nodded, too shaken to argue. As they began their trek back through the forest, the journey felt longer, as though the trees themselves were reluctant to release them. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Clara could feel the forest watching, its unseen eyes tracking their every move, but she refused to look back. It wasn't until they emerged from the tree line that she allowed herself to breathe. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light washing over the quiet town of Vale Verde in the distance. Yet, the sight offered no comfort. Clara knew the forest wasn't done with her. Not yet. In the days that followed, the town seemed oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded. People whispered about the strange sounds and lights from the forest, but no one dared investigate further. Rogério's disappearance was chalked up to reckless behavior, a fate he had invited upon himself with his arrogance. Clara, however, knew the truth. She carried it with her like a shadow, following her through every moment of her waking life. She avoided the forest, but it never truly left her. At night, she dreamed of Lucas, not the vibrant, teasing brother she remembered, but the gaunt, hollow-eyed figure kneeling before the creature. She woke often in a cold sweat, the echoes of his final words ringing in her ears. The altar haunted her thoughts. The symbols etched into its surface, the faint whispers in the air. It was as if the forest had imprinted itself onto her very being. She tried to push it away, to bury it beneath the mundanity of her duties, but it always crept back, lurking in the corners of her mind. One evening, as she sat in her dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at a photo of Lucas, there was a knock at the door. Father Miguel stood on the threshold, his expression a mix of concern and something deeper, something darker. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his hands clutching an old, leather-bound book. "I've been doing some research," he began, his voice low. "About the forest. About what you saw." Clara stiffened, but gestured for him to sit. As he opened the book, its brittle pages filled with ancient drawings and cryptic text, her stomach twisted. The images mirrored what she had seen: the altar, the creature, the symbols. But there was more. The creature wasn't just a beast, Miguel continued. It was a guardian, a servant of something much older, much darker. And the ritual, it wasn't meant to end. It was meant to continue. Forever. Clara's blood ran cold. She stared at the pages, her mind racing. The whispers in the forest, the oppressive darkness, they hadn't been banished. They had simply been subdued. "It's not over, is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miguel shook his head. "No, it's only a matter of time before it begins again." As the realization settled over her, Clara felt a wave of dread she hadn't known was possible. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, only to find herself standing at the edge of something far worse. Yet, deep within her, a spark ignited. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but determination. "I'll be ready," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever comes next, I'll be ready." That night, as the moonlight filtered through her window, Clara sat alone, clutching Lucas's photo. The forest loomed on the horizon, its shadow stretching toward her like a warning. She didn't sleep, her mind replaying the events of that night over and over. But one thought stood out above the rest, a whisper that echoed through her soul. The forest doesn't forget. And neither will I. Days turned into weeks, but the events in the forest remained fresh in Clara's mind, etched like scars that would never fade. The air in Vale Verde seemed lighter, as if a dark weight had been lifted, but to Clara, the relief was only superficial. She knew what had happened was far from over. The forest still loomed at the edge of town, silent and watchful, a predator waiting for its moment to strike again. Clara found herself avoiding reflective surfaces, mirrors, windows, even puddles of water. She couldn't bear the thought of catching a glimpse of Lucas's face again, distorted by memory and guilt. Yet, in her dreams, she saw him clearly. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and sorrowful, his eyes hollow but pleading. "Don't forget me," he whispered each time before vanishing into the shadows. She began keeping a journal, not to make sense of what had happened, but to keep the details sharp. Every whisper, every claw mark, every guttural growl was documented with obsessive precision. She couldn't let herself forget, couldn't allow the truth to slip away into the haze of denial that had gripped the town. This was her burden, and she would carry it alone. Father Miguel visited often, his presence a quiet comfort in the growing isolation she felt. He brought books, ancient texts and forbidden tomes, that spoke of the creature and the ritual. Together, they pieced together fragments of a truth that was too vast and horrifying to fully comprehend. The creature wasn't just a monster, it was a sentinel, a guardian of something buried deep beneath the forest floor. Something that demanded blood and fear to remain dormant. "It's been centuries since the last ritual was interrupted," Miguel said one evening, his voice heavy with unease. "What you did, it broke the cycle. But I fear it won't stay broken. Whatever that thing was protecting, it's still out there, waiting." Clara nodded, her expression grim. "Then we need to be ready," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. But readiness came at a cost. Clara began to withdraw from her colleagues, her friends, the world. She patrolled the outskirts of the forest nightly, her flashlight cutting through the shadows as she searched for signs of its return. She became a ghost of herself, haunted by the knowledge of what lay just beyond the tree line. Her determination to protect the town was unshakable, but it isolated her, pushing her further into the darkness she sought to combat. One night, as she stood at the edge of the forest, she heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Her heart pounded as she strained to hear, every muscle in her body taut with anticipation. The whisper grew louder, forming words that sent a chill down her spine. "You set it free." Clara's flashlight flickered, its beam wavering as the darkness seemed to press closer. She stepped back, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. But the forest remained still, its trees swaying gently in the breeze as if mocking her. The voice was gone, but its message lingered, a reminder that her battle was far from over. The next morning, she returned to the clearing with Miguel. The altar was gone, the symbols erased as though the forest had reclaimed them. But the air was different, thick and heavy, humming with an energy that made her skin crawl. Miguel knelt, placing a hand on the ground. "It's sleeping," he murmured, his voice tinged with both relief and dread. "For now." Clara exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She knew what this meant. The forest wasn't finished with her, and whatever lay beneath its roots was only biding its time. She glanced at Miguel, his face etched with lines of worry, and nodded. "Then we have to make sure it stays that way," she said. As they left the forest, Clara felt a strange sense of clarity. She couldn't change what had happened, couldn't bring Lucas back or undo the horrors she had witnessed. But she could fight. She could prepare. The forest may have claimed her brother, but it wouldn't claim her town, not while she still drew breath. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, the whispers returned. Soft and fleeting, they danced at the edge of her hearing, impossible to ignore. She turned to the window, her reflection staring back at her. For a moment, she thought she saw Lucas standing behind her, his face twisted in sorrow. But when she blinked, he was gone. Clara closed her journal, her hand lingering on its cover. She had written everything she could, documented every detail of that cursed night, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The forest would call again. And when it did, she would be waiting. Some stories don't have happy endings, but they need to be told. What would you do if you were in Clara's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Sinister Stories. The forest is still out there, waiting, and so are we. Until next time, if you dare to return.